The dusty plains of northern Kenya stretched endlessly under the scorching afternoon sun, but nothing could have prepared the local Maasai villagers for what they witnessed that day. A wild cheetah, one of the most elusive predators in Africa, had been sitting motionless outside a simple mud brick house for 3 consecutive days, refusing to leave despite the presence of humans. The spotted cat wasn't hunting, wasn't territorial. It was simply waiting, as if keeping vigil over someone inside. Inside that humble dwelling, 68-year-old former Marine Sergeant Thomas "Tank" McKenzie lay on a narrow bed, his once powerful frame now reduced to skin and bones. The same hands that had carried wounded comrades through the jungles of Vietnam, that had later spent 15 years working with anti-poaching units across East Africa, now trembled as they reached for a glass of water. Dr. Amara Ochieng had delivered the news 3 weeks ago. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, perhaps a month left to live. Tank had made his choice without hesitation. No hospitals in Nairobi, no expensive treatments that would only prolong suffering. He would face his final battle here in the remote village of Lakori, where he had spent the last decade of his retirement helping local communities protect their livestock from wildlife conflicts. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who had survived mortar attacks and jungle warfare would meet his end in the same landscape he had grown to love. The cheetah's presence baffled everyone. Kisi, Tank's devoted Maasai assistant and translator, had lived in this region his entire 43 years and had never seen such behavior. Wild cheetahs avoided human settlements, preferring the open savanna where their incredible speed gave them every advantage. Yet this particular cat, a magnificent male with distinctive black tear marks running from his golden eyes to his mouth, seemed drawn to Tank's dwelling like a moth to flame. What the villagers didn't know, what even Kisi hadn't yet pieced together, was the connection that bound these two unlikely souls. 7 years ago, during one of Tank's routine patrols with the Kenya Wildlife Service, he had discovered a young cheetah caught in a poacher's wire snare, barely alive, his left front paw nearly severed. Most would have considered the animal too far gone, but Tank saw something in those amber eyes, the same fierce determination to survive that he had witnessed in wounded Marines decades earlier. The rescue had been brutal and dangerous. Tank had spent 6 hours carefully cutting through the wire while the semi-conscious cheetah fought against his touch. Blood loss was severe, infection had already set in, and the nearest veterinary station was 8 hours away by jeep. But Tank had made a promise to that dying animal, whispering words of encouragement as he worked, the same way he had once comforted his wounded brothers in arms. Tank's weathered hands gripped the satellite phone as Dr. Ochieng's voice crackled through the static. The options were clear: immediate transport to Nairobi General Hospital for aggressive chemotherapy, or hospice care in the city where proper pain management could be administered. The doctor painted no false pictures of hope. Even with treatment, Tank might gain 3 additional months, but they would be months of nausea, weakness, and sterile hospital rooms. "Doc, I appreciate everything you've done for me, but I'm staying put. This is where I belong." The silence on the other end spoke volumes. Dr. Ochieng had seen this stubborn streak in Tank before, the same iron will that had driven him to spend sleepless nights nursing injured animals back to health, the same determination that made him trek through dangerous territory to mediate conflicts between farmers and wildlife. When the call ended, Tank slowly made his way to the small wooden chair on his porch, the same spot where he had spent countless evenings watching the sun paint the acacia trees gold. His modest home sat on the edge of Lakori village, close enough to the community he served, but positioned to offer an unobstructed view of the vast savanna that had become his sanctuary. The house itself was nothing remarkable. Mud brick walls, a corrugated iron roof, and a small generator that provided electricity for a few hours each evening. Kisi arrived, as he always did, just as the first stars began to appear. The Maasai man had been Tank's right hand for over a decade, translating not just language but culture, helping the American veteran understand the delicate balance between tradition and conservation. Tonight, however, Kesey's usual warm greeting was replaced by concern etched deep in his weathered features.
"Buena Tank, the elders are worried about the cheetah," Kesey said, settling onto a three-legged stool beside the porch. "I have not eaten in 3 days. Normally we would drive it away, but—" He paused, searching for the right words in English. "But it watches your house like it knows something we do not." Tank's eyes drifted toward the distant acacia tree where the cheetah maintained its mysterious vigil. Even in the gathering darkness, he could make out the animal's silhouette, perfectly still except for the occasional flick of its tail. Something about the cat's posture, the way it held its head, stirred a memory that Tank couldn't quite grasp. The pain medication was making his thoughts fuzzy, but there was something familiar about this particular cheetah, something that tugged at the edges of his consciousness like a half-remembered dream. The cheetah had first appeared on a Tuesday morning, emerging from the tall grass like a golden ghost. Mama Wanjiku, the village's eldest woman, had been hanging laundry when she spotted the distinctive spotted coat moving with fluid grace across the clearing. Her sharp intake of breath had alerted the other women, who quickly gathered their children and retreated to the safety of their homes. But the cheetah showed no interest in the villagers or their livestock. Instead, it had positioned itself beneath the sprawling fever tree that stood roughly 60 meters from Tank's house, settling into a sphinx-like pose with its amber eyes fixed directly on Tank's front door. The behavior defied every piece of wildlife knowledge the community possessed. Cheetahs were solitary, nervous creatures who avoided human contact at all costs. They were built for speed, not confrontation, preferring to hunt in open grasslands where they could spot prey from distant distances. This one, however, seemed content to remain stationary, breaking from its watch only to shift positions as the sun moved across the sky, always maintaining the same focused attention on Tank's dwelling. Dr. Sarah Kimutai from the Kenya Wildlife Service had received Kesey's radio call and arrived the following afternoon, her Land Cruiser kicking up clouds of red dust as it pulled into the village. A wildlife behaviorist with 15 years of field experience, she had studied cheetah populations across East Africa and had never encountered anything remotely similar to what the villagers described. Through her binoculars, Dr. Kimutai observed the male cheetah for 3 hours straight. The animal appeared to be in excellent physical condition, well-muscled, alert, with a glossy coat that indicated proper nutrition. More puzzling still, the cheetah showed no signs of stress or agitation despite being surrounded by human activity. Village children playing, women cooking over open fires, men tending to their cattle, none of it seemed to disturb the cat's concentrated vigil. Inside the modest dwelling, Tank's condition deteriorated with alarming speed. Each morning brought new challenges, breathing that required more effort, persistent nausea that made eating nearly impossible, and waves of pain that seemed to originate from deep within his bones. The military-issued morphine patches Dr. Ochieng had left behind provided some relief, but Tank found himself rationing them, unsure how long his supplies would last. Kesey had taken on the role of primary caregiver without being asked. Every dawn found the Maasai man quietly entering Tank's home, carrying a thermos of sweet tea and whatever food he hoped might tempt his friend's diminished appetite. Kesey's wife, Naserian, had begun preparing special broths using traditional herbs known for their healing properties, though both understood they were fighting a battle that medicine, traditional or modern, could not win. The most heartbreaking aspect for Kesey was watching Tank struggle with his unfinished work. Scattered across the small wooden table were dozens of notebooks filled with Tank's meticulous handwriting, detailed observations about wildlife migration patterns, conflict resolution strategies that had successfully reduced human-animal encounters, and comprehensive maps marking every water source and grazing area within a 50-kilometer radius. This knowledge represented more than academic research.
It was a practical guide born from years of walking among both animals and people, understanding their needs and finding ways for them to coexist. Tank had planned to compile everything into a comprehensive manual for future conservationists, but his failing eyesight and increasingly unsteady hands made the task impossible. "Kessie, we need to get this information preserved," Tank whispered during one of his more lucid moments, gesturing weakly toward the scattered papers. "Everything I've learned about reducing livestock predation, the seasonal movement patterns, the traditional methods your elders taught me, it can't die with me." The urgency in Tank's voice reflected his growing awareness that time was shortening running. Dr. Ochieng's weekly visits had become more frequent, and each examination revealed further decline. Tank's weight had dropped dangerously low, his skin had taken on a yellowed pallor, and the periods between lucid moments were growing longer. Meanwhile, the cheetah's vigil continued uninterrupted. Villagers reported that the animal remained in position throughout the night, its eyes reflecting moonlight like twin amber beacons. Even during the brief afternoon thunderstorms that swept across the savanna, the cheetah endured the downpour without seeking shelter, as if nothing could drive it from its chosen post. By the end of the first week, the cheetah's behavior had grown even more extraordinary. No longer content to remain at the distant fever tree, the magnificent cat had begun moving progressively closer to Tank's home. Each day brought the animal several meters nearer, until it now rested beneath a small acacia bush barely 30 meters from the front porch. The boldness of this movement sent ripples of anxiety through the village. Elder Lemayan, the most respected voice in Lokori, called for an emergency meeting of the village council. The old man's weathered face bore the gravity of someone who had lived through decades of human-wildlife conflicts and understood the delicate balance that kept both communities safe. "This is not natural behavior," Lemayan declared, his voice carrying the authority of 7 decades spent reading the rhythms of the savanna. "When animals change their ways, it means something powerful is stirring. We must be prepared for whatever message this cheetah brings." The other elders nodded sullenly, their own instincts telling them that they were witnessing something beyond ordinary wildlife behavior. Dr. Kimutai had extended her stay indefinitely, fascinated by what she was observing. Her daily reports to the Kenya Wildlife Service headquarters in Nairobi were met with skepticism from colleagues who struggled to believe her detailed accounts. She had documented the cheetah's methodical approach, noting that each movement closer to the house was deliberate and calculated, never showing signs of aggression or territorial marking. More remarkably still, the cheetah had begun displaying what could only be described as protective behavior. When a pack of wild dogs had ventured too close to the village during their evening hunt, the cheetah had risen to its full height and released a series of sharp chirps, the species equivalent of a warning call. The dogs, recognizing the presence of a superior predator, had immediately altered their course and disappeared into the darkness. Tank remained largely unaware of these developments, his consciousness now drifting in and out like waves against a distant shore. During his brief periods of clarity, he would ask Kessie to help him to the window, where he could peer through the grimy glass toward the spot where villagers reported the cheetah maintained its watch. Something about the animal's presence stirred deep memories, fragments of images that seemed important but remained frustratingly out of reach. The decision came during Tank's worst night yet. Dr. Ochieng had made an emergency visit after Kessie's frantic radio call, finding the veteran writhing in pain that the morphine patches could no longer control. Tank's breathing had become labored and irregular, his pulse weak and thready. The doctor administered a stronger painkiller through injection, but his expression told Kessie everything he needed to know. "He has perhaps 48 hours,"
Dr. Ochieng said quietly as they stood outside the house. Maybe less. His body is shutting down. The doctor's clinical tone couldn't mask his genuine affection for the stubborn American who had become a fixture in this remote corner of Kenya. I can arrange for helicopter transport to Nairobi. We have better pain management facilities there, and he wouldn't have to die alone. Kessie shook his head firmly. Bwana Tank made his choice. He wants to die where he lived, where he found purpose. The Maasai man's voice carried the weight of cultural understanding, the importance of dying in one's chosen place, surrounded by the land and community that had given life meaning. That morning, as the first light painted the savannah in shades of gold and crimson, Tank managed to whisper a request that stopped Kessie in his tracks. "I want to see the cheetah," he said, his voice barely audible. "Please. I need to see it clearly, just once." The request was beyond dangerous. Moving a dying man outside, exposing him to a wild predator violated every principle of medical care and common sense. Dr. Ochieng, when consulted via radio, was adamantly opposed. Absolutely not. The stress alone could kill him instantly, and if that cheetah perceives him as vulnerable prey? But Kessie understood something the doctor could not. He had watched Tank's eyes during the brief moments when the veteran glimpsed the cheetah through his window. There was recognition there, a flicker of something profound that transcended the fog of medication and pain. This wasn't the whim of a delirious man. It was a deep need that Kessie felt compelled to honor. Elder Lemayan, when approached for counsel, surprised everyone with his response. "Sometimes the spirits speak through the animals," the old man said slowly. "If this cheetah has come to guide Bwana Tank's journey to the ancestors, we should not interfere with what is meant to be." The village council convened an emergency session that lasted until noon, debating the unprecedented request with the gravity it deserved. Against all medical advice and conventional wisdom, the decision was made. Kessie, along with his teenage son Sankale and 2 other village men, carefully fashioned a makeshift stretcher using a canvas tarp and sturdy wooden poles. Dr. Kimutai positioned herself with a tranquilizer gun, though she privately doubted its effectiveness if the cheetah decided to attack. Emergency radio contact with the nearest medical facility remained open, and Dr. Ochieng reluctantly agreed to remain on standby via satellite phone. The operation began at sunset, when the temperature had cooled and the golden light would be gentlest on Tank's sensitive eyes. Moving with the reverence of a funeral procession, the men lifted Tank from his bed and carried him through the doorway he had not crossed in over a week. Tank's body felt impossibly light, his breathing shallow but steady, as they positioned the stretcher in the small clearing between his house and the acacia bush where the cheetah waited. The response was immediate and extraordinary. The moment Tank appeared in the open air, the cheetah rose to her feet with fluid grace, her entire demeanor shifting from patient observation to intense focus. The magnificent cat began moving forward with deliberate, measured steps, each paw placement precise and purposeful. There was no stalking posture, no predatory tension, just a majestic animal approaching with what could only be described as dignity.
Tank's eyes, which had been clouded with pain and medication for days, suddenly blazed with clarity. His trembling hand reached upward as recognition flooded his features. "Duma," he whispered, using the Swahili word for cheetah, but there was something more personal in his tone, as if he were calling a name rather than identifying a species. The cheetah stopped just 3 meters away, lowering itself into a resting position while maintaining eye contact with the dying man. In that moment, the barriers between wild and human, predator and prey, seemed to dissolve entirely. The assembled witnesses found themselves holding their breath, aware they were observing something that defied every law of nature they had ever known. Kessie felt tears running down his cheeks as he watched his friend's face transform with wonder and peace. The memory crashed over Tank like a breaking wave, bringing with it perfect clarity despite the morphine coursing through his system. 7 years dissolved in an instant, and he was back in the thornbush country near Samburu, kneeling beside a young cheetah whose left front paw was grotesquely mangled in a poacher's wire snare. The wire had cut so deeply that bone was visible, and infection had already begun its deadly work. "I remember you now," Tank whispered, his voice carrying across the evening air with surprising strength. "You fought me every step of the way, didn't you? Even when you were dying, you still had fire in your eyes." The cheetah's ears twitched at the sound of Tank's voice, and incredibly, the animal took another step closer, now less than 2 meters from the stretcher. That day 7 years ago had been one of the longest of Tank's life. The nearest veterinary station was hours away over rough terrain, and the cheetah was fading fast. Tank had made the decision to attempt field surgery right there in the bush, using his military first aid training and a bottle of whiskey as disinfectant. For 6 grueling hours, he had worked to save the paw, while the semi-conscious cheetah alternated between unconsciousness and fierce resistance. The cheetah now lifted its left front paw slightly, and Tank could see the faint scars that remained as evidence of their shared ordeal. The paw had healed well, though Tank noticed a slight favoring that indicated permanent damage. Damage that hadn't prevented this magnificent animal from surviving and thriving in one of Africa's harshest environments. "You were so young then," Tank continued, his voice growing softer but somehow reaching everyone present. "Just a teenager in cheetah years, probably driven from your mother's territory and trying to establish your own. The poachers would have taken your pelt and left you to rot." The cheetah lowered its head slightly, as if acknowledging the words, and released a soft chirping sound that cheetahs typically used for communication with their cubs. Dr. Kimutai slowly lowered her tranquilizer gun, realizing that she was witnessing something far beyond her scientific training. The interaction between man and beast carried an emotional depth that transcended species barriers. The cheetah's posture radiated not aggression or curiosity, but something that could only be described as gratitude and recognition. As if responding to some invisible signal, the cheetah carefully lowered itself to the ground, settling into a position that mirrored Tank's reclined form on the stretcher, their eyes never breaking contact. Tank died peacefully 3 hours after midnight, his breathing simply becoming slower and gentler until it stopped entirely. His final words, whispered to Kessie in the darkness, were about the notebook and ensuring the cheetah research would continue. The Maasai man held his friend's hand as the last breath escaped, feeling the exact moment when Tank's spirit departed for whatever lay beyond. The cheetah seemed to sense the transition immediately. The magnificent cat rose to its feet, approached the still form on the stretcher, and released a series of soft, chirping calls that echoed across the silent savanna. The sounds were unlike anything Dr. Kimutai had recorded in her years of cheetah research. Not the typical territorial vocalizations or hunting calls, but something that resembled a lament, a farewell song in a language only the wild could understand. After several minutes of this extraordinary vocalization, the cheetah turned toward the vast darkness of the savanna and began walking with the same deliberate pace it had used to approach. The assembled villagers watched in respectful silence as the spotted form disappeared into the night, swallowed by shadows and acacia groves. None of them would ever see this particular cheetah again, though its presence had left an indelible mark on their understanding of the connection between all living things. The funeral took place 2 days later beneath the same fever tree where the cheetah had first begun its vigil. Tank had requested a simple burial according to local customs wrapped in traditional Maasai cloth and interred facing the sunrise. Representatives from the Kenya Wildlife Service attended, along with conservationists from across East Africa who had known Tank's work and respected his unconventional methods. Elder Lemayon performed the ceremony in both English and Ma, speaking of Tank as a bridge between worlds, a warrior who had found peace by serving something greater than himself. The old man's words carried special weight, for Tank had been formally adopted into the village during his final years, given the Maasai name Oltumuren, meaning the one who helps others grow. Dr. Ochieng spoke about Tank's medical contributions to remote communities, while Dr. Kimutai shared her scientific observations of the unprecedented cheetah behavior. But it was Kessie who delivered the most powerful eulogy, describing Tank not as a foreigner who had come to help, but as a man who had become part of the land itself, inseparable from the wildlife and people he had served. 2 years after Tank's passing, the Conservation Center bearing his name had become a beacon for wildlife researchers across Africa. Kessie, now the facility's head coordinator, had successfully digitized Tank's notebooks with help from international partners, creating a comprehensive database that revolutionized human-wildlife conflict resolution throughout East Africa. The methods Tank had developed were being implemented from Tanzania to Ethiopia, saving countless lives on both sides of the species divide. The center's most treasured exhibit remained Tank's final photograph, a grainy image captured by Dr. Kimutai showing the moment when man and cheetah had gazed into each other's eyes for the last time. Visitors often stood before this picture in reverent silence, struggling to comprehend the depth of connection it represented. But the most extraordinary chapter was yet to be written. On the second anniversary of Tank's death, as the village gathered for their annual memorial ceremony, a familiar, spotted form emerged from the morning mist. The cheetah had returned, but this time it was not alone. 3 cubs followed their father, learning from his example as they approached the gravesite with cautious respect. The villagers watched in amazement as the adult cheetah led his offspring in what could only be described as a pilgrimage, introducing them to the final resting place of the man who had given their father a second chance at life. For nearly an hour, the family remained near Tank's grave before disappearing back into the vast savanna, leaving behind paw prints in the red earth and wonder in human hearts. Tank's legacy lived on not just in conservation victories or scientific publications, but in the mysterious bond between species that his compassion had forged. His story proved that kindness echoes across time, creating connections that death cannot sever. If this incredible tale of loyalty and gratitude touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories of the unbreakable bonds between humans and the wild. Share this video to spread Tank's inspiring message that every act of compassion matters, no matter how small.